Well, good morning to everyone. What an interesting time that we live in. This is a curious reading today about betrayal of one's ideals by Judas. It's somewhat appropriate. I often field or get asked to field questions from the Ananda website for America. And a curious one came the other day. It said, do you think that the statement Yogananda made long ago that someday there would be a revolution in this country, do you think this is beginning? And I think it probably is. We'll come back to that. Because, as Krishna says in the Gita, Bhagavad Gita, the yogi feels the pangs and sorrows of all. Centuries and centuries of suffering based on race, for example, what to mention other things, conquest, for example. Make an accumulation, a bank, if you will, a hoard of the need for compassion and righteousness that pour down like rivers, I believe was something Martin Luther King said. So our hearts go out at this time. Yet it's a curious thing. We stand as triune beings between heaven and earth. We stand between eternity and this moment. And we cycle back and forth between the two of them. Ananda as such represent an ancient and universal teaching that we are essentially, and the world itself is essentially transcendent. And that the ups and downs, the sorrows and pleasures and joy, etc., of life is the necessary ingredients for this creation to continue. Should that make us, therefore, indifferent to the sufferings of others because we are, as they say, above it all? Do we roll up our sleeves and get swept up in the emotions of this moment, which are mixed with both anger as well as peace? Because this world is an admixture of the opposites. Do we, because it's tainted, therefore, stick our nose in the air and say it's beneath us to get involved? These are difficult questions for us to think about and to act upon. What we're seeing in our deeply polarized society, I suppose it's always been, but at least in my life it seems intensely more so. No matter what you open your mouth and say, somebody is going to jump into it and disagree. We have had a few, not very many, but we too have received our brickbats for the statements we have made. Again, very little percentage-wise, but what one speaks for many, and this has to be accepted. And so where do we go in this? Well, let's take a moment and look at Judas. He was one of the 12. Yogananda said he was a prophet. I don't really know what he meant by the word prophet, but he had to be highly advanced spiritually to be one of the 12. Oh, isn't Judas a symbol for you and I? Are we not one of the 12 disciples, as it were, those of us gathered in the name of God, Christ, and the Masters? And when you look at the other apostles, they're pretty ordinary and honestly not very bright. When you think of the questions they plied Jesus with. Judas, by contrast, was from upper middle class. He was educated in the tribe of scribes. They say he was quite handsome, a very magnetic individual. He could have easily have been, and perhaps was, the PR man for the band of disciples, for all we know. He obviously had access to the halls of power in the Temple of Jerusalem. And so, on what level did he betray his own ideals? I'm going to segue somewhere else right now. when the current president, whose name I have difficulties pronouncing, was elected, I thought to myself, when I saw the boorishness of his character, I thought, no one would call me an optimist, but I said, the good news here is that Americans will have an opportunity to see of what stuff we're made. Where do we want to go? Who are we as Americans? And I think back, does anybody out there in video land remember the TV show All in the Family with Archie Bunker? Well, actually, he was a great actor, and it was a charming, very innocent show when we look back now. But at the time, it was somewhat controversial because it was, I don't know if the first time, because I never watched much TV in my life anyway, but where boorishness, ignorance, redneckism, whatever, was sort of paraded on TV as being normal. All I can say is that in our society, boorishness has simply increased. Body parts, body noises, all these things that were just taboo in my upbringing are now just common currency. And so, is this what we are as Americans? Are we boorish, overstuffed in our houses, in our trucks, in our cars? And are we just the ugly American? It certainly seems so. At least it seems as if it's normal, acceptable. And so when I think of when this fellow was elected, I thought, well, we'd have an opportunity as a nation to step back and say, oh my God, is this what we have become? Never mind policies. I'm not interested in policies per se. In fact, I'd say I'm more conservative than liberal, but that's for another time. In any case, character. I'm talking about character. I'm talking about attitudes. And so we see in Judas, he had an attachment to power and money. Money and power basically go together, at least money and security, certainly. But eventually, as you get more of the stuff, you gain influence and so on. And so ultimately they are, in their ultimate expression at least, very connected. And so he had some karma about that. America, especially since the fall of the Soviet Union, but even after World War II, has been something of an egotist on the world scene, somewhat of a bully, no less. And so these are the caricatures, these are the self-images that have been projected. Maybe not me or you, but there it is. And what do we do about it? Well, I'd like to think there's a lot of people who want to do something about that. On the other hand, as a yogi, as one who lives in the center, who aspires to the heavenly realms of the eternal now, is it just another passing fad? Is it just another passing wave of mass hysteria? I think that's also true, in fact. After all, when you think about racial violence predicated on racial prejudice, just go back a few decades. I came of age in the 60s when not just one man or here or there, but I mean the violence perpetrated by the law and accepted, not investigated, and I think of lynchings and mobs throughout the world. Have we made progress? Yes, we have made progress. In fact, the moral outrage at this is, in fact, again, I being a thoroughly indoctrinated optimist, not true, is in fact, like that president of ours, cause for hope. This morning, Padma sent me an article. I don't really pay attention to a lot of things in politics. My disgust with politics began in the 60s, as indeed it should for my generation. But she showed me an article that most of the military leaders in our government are stepping back and refusing to allow the military forces of our nation to be used for crowd control and to limit the constitutional rights of our people. I think that's a very good sign. I don't know how true it is. Like I say, I don't usually believe everything I read. But nonetheless, if it's true, and to the extent it is, I think that's a good sign. And there's also other waffling going on, apparently, in political realms of the Republican Party. I would say that the current president betrayed the ideals of that party. And you know, I've studied war, and I'm thinking of World War II, and I've studied the moral dilemma of so-called collaborators. Some collaborators could be in positions at great risk to their own lives to actually help their country during times of conquest. Yogananda's father, for example, could be called a collaborator. He and Lahiri Mahashai worked for the British. Okay? And so you see, these moral things are not that simple, not that easy. Other collaborators, of course, are traitors, pure and simple. At the end of World War II, most of them got shot by mobs, by partisans, whether or not they were good, bad, or indifferent. And so we have here in racism, it's like a tsunami, a large tsunami, and now it's sort of being seen. Will it change? The more things change, the more they stay the same. Again, my decades of life experience are, they'll change a little bit. We'll just see. Why? Because hatred and prejudice reside not in legislation, not in funding, but in the hearts. And yet those things can help. In the 60s, the changing of laws that Martin Luther King and his followers pretty much single-handedly incited have made changes, certainly in behavior, but I think also in the hearts of people. Sometimes you get caught up in your own tribe of maybe being a redneck or something, and you just don't know how to get out of it. You know, you've been indoctrinated in a certain way of thinking, and maybe you don't have the intelligence or the courage or the opportunity to really stand apart from that. It takes a lot of courage to do that. And so we are witnessing, I believe, an event that will go down in the history books. Not that I care all that much about history books, but it is certainly a good sign. But we must also be careful, like Judas, not to betray our ideals. His access to power, his his attraction to power and money. You know, in the movie Jesus of Nazareth, which is the only movie of the life of Jesus I feel particularly in tune in, I've seen a few others, he's portrayed, Judas is portrayed as hoping that Jesus would either foment the overthrow of the Romans or have some part to play in that. I think that's entirely credible. It certainly fits his access to power, and so that particular portrayal, although not endorsed or shown in the Bible itself, makes a lot of sense. And so it is down through history. I think of during Nazi times, the Lutheran Church more or less sold out to the Nazis. What was that fellow's name? Just a great hero. I just suddenly can't think of it. Bonhoeffer. Wonderful story. He was killed by the Nazis within the last days of the war. But he stood up for principles. And somehow, because of his prestige, in his status, his caste in Germany, he managed to evade incarceration until the very end. I think of how many churches in America, white churches, supported segregation. You see, it's very, very nuanced, this aspect of things. We can betray our own high ideals by the comfort that we have, by the hope that we imagine worldly power. That can go both ways, in other words, because the other way it can go, apart from aligning ourselves with the establishment, as we used to call it in the 60s, is also to feel. Well, I'll tell you a story. Swami Kriyananda, I forget where it took place. I'm thinking England, but I don't really know, where some Anglican priest-type person got up and just shouted at the top of his lungs how we should help the prostitutes and we should help the down and out and all this and that. And the anger on his face betrayed his own ideals of love for God and love for all. And so are we going to be caught up in the anger and the emotion of this and betray our own ideals of centeredness? Each person has to decide how to respond to one's own heart's natural feelings. The question has always come up in Ananda's history: why don't you do more for the poor? Or variations on that. There is a stunning paragraph in the autobiography of a yogi, chapter 45, The Blissful Mother, Anandamoyi Ma. Right at the end of that chapter, there is a blistering paragraph, the only one I think in the entire book, in which Yogananda basically chastises Western culture for idolatry at the shrine of charity as an excuse for not living by the first commandment: thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind, and soul. You see, these are not simple teachings. Ananda's particular mission, I don't really care for that word mission. One time Swami was asked what our mission was, and he said it was to have fun. Well, okay. But nonetheless, what we represent, the ideals of Sanatana Dharma, represents transcendence. I do think that as Ananda establishes itself, we're only 50 years old, I mean, compared to established religions, let's say. I think in time, and we have a few charitable works happening, I think in time more and more of that will take place. But until we're well established in our own commitment, in our own ideals, I do think we have to be cautious about betraying those ideals on the basis of otherwise worthwhile values. During the 80s, for example, at Ananda Village, the original community, there was a movement afoot towards family values. And those family values, it was perceived quickly by Swami Kriyananda and by a few others, he discerned right away that those were a deflection from the inner path of meditation and the goal of ego transcendence, under the banner of worthwhile goals, helping our children, serving our families, etc., became an excuse for lack of attunement to the divine will. These are hard choices that we have to make. Ultimately, they're individual choices. And I do hope if we could find a way by which we could reach out to people of color. For Ananda, people of color are from South Asia. It's a bit ironic, but you know, the history of Africa is a long and complex history. Swami Kriyananda speaks of that history in some of his writings. He talks about how in the descending ages, throughout the world certainly, but specifically in Africa, Egypt as well, which had once been a high civilization, involvement with black magic became a curse. And you know those white slave traders, you know who they traded with? Africans who captured and sold into slavery their brothers. Life is not that simple. And I remember something I mentioned at our satsang the other day. And I feel it, I know it's true. Martin Luther King said that the African Americans have suffered in such a way that they are uniquely suited, not all of them obviously, but out of that pool of karmic suffering as a race will come, has come, people of great nobility, because suffering is the doorway to transcendence. Suffering is the doorway to compassion. And I remember when, what was his name, Barack Obama was elected, it was a thrilling moment for this nation. And yet the hatred and vilification that he endured for no reason. Perhaps he was a little bit too dry as an intellectual when I think of Martin Luther King, who was a fiery person, much more inclined myself to admire. But so whatever his karma was, I don't know. But even I was shocked by the vilification that he endured under his. But more will come, because that's how the law of karma works. Each of us, on the one hand, should try to remain centered, because there is this tsunami of emotional mass hysteria, but it has a valid and deep truth at its core. Let's focus on the truth and respond by that truth within each of us individually. That shall make us free, not drag us into more bondage of emotions and anger and the loss of our own spiritual equilibrium. We each have a path to follow. Rescuing other races, rescuing other people, well, there's much work to do, but you have to decide if it's your work. Ananda, if it's from that particular vantage point, I suppose, also has to be true to its ideals and to its mission as well. There are no easy answers, and yet in the end, I think I share with most of you, some of you, that I'm very optimistic and heartened by current events. Let's have some music.